June 7, 1944, 1,000 feet above the English Channel. Lieutenant Robert Wilkins gripped the control column of his P-51 Mustang as the formation of American fighters cut through the heavy morning fog. In less than 24 hours, hundreds of Allied bombers would thunder across these same waters toward occupied France, and his squadron had been tasked with clearing the skies in preparation. Wilkins smiled with confidence as he checked his fuel gauge, showing 3/4 full, certain they would complete their mission with plenty of reserve to return home. He could not have imagined that within months, he and countless other American pilots would be deliberately attempting landings with empty tanks, in a desperate gamble that would transform aerial warfare forever. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how American innovation and industrial might created an aviation miracle that German pilots considered impossible until they witnessed it with their own eyes, a technological advantage so profound that it would change the psychological dimension of aerial combat and contribute significantly to Allied air superiority in the final stages of World War II. Captain Werner Milders stood rigid at attention in the briefing room of Jagdgeschwader 51 at the Luftwaffe airfield near Saint-Omer, France. A seasoned ace with 78 confirmed kills, Milders had earned every decoration the Third Reich could bestow upon its airmen. Yet on this cold February morning in 1945, his voice betrayed a hint of strain as he addressed the assembled pilots. "Gentlemen, our reconnaissance has confirmed new American tactics that sound like fantasy, but multiple observers have verified the same impossible phenomenon," Milders said, his voice echoing in the Spartan room. "Long-range American fighters are now arriving over Berlin with fuel gauges reading empty, sometimes flying for 30 minutes or more in this state, before returning to their bases in England or recently captured airfields in France." Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, a 23-year-old pilot with 17 aerial victories, raised his hand. "Captain, with respect that defies the basic laws of aviation. No aircraft flies without fuel." "I would have said the same yesterday," Milders replied, sliding reconnaissance photographs across the wooden table. "Yet here we have documented evidence of P-51 Mustangs with engines still running despite their auxiliary tanks being visibly jettisoned and their standard tanks theoretically depleted based on their flight times and distances." The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. "The Americans have always had resources," continued Milders, "but this suggests an entirely new technology, perhaps some kind of secondary fuel system or emergency reserve we know nothing about. If they can fly longer and farther than we calculate, it completely disrupts our defensive strategies." Across the Channel at Royal Air Force Station Bodney in Norfolk, England, Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group was having a very different conversation with his pilots. A Medal of Honor recipient known for single-handedly defending a bomber formation against 30 German fighters, Howard had earned the respect of every man under his command. "Gentlemen, I've just returned from 8th Air Force Headquarters with news that will change how we fly," Howard announced to the gathered American pilots. "The technical modification we've been testing on select aircraft has been approved for implementation across all P-51 groups effective immediately." Lieutenant Wilkins, now a veteran of 37 combat missions, leaned forward with interest. After months of increasing German resistance and mounting losses among bomber crews, any potential advantage captured his full attention. "Engineering has confirmed the successful integration of the Merlin engine with the Packard manufacturing process has yielded an unexpected efficiency," Howard continued, gesturing to a technical diagram being distributed. "The precision machining of the cylinder walls and piston rings at the Packard plant has reduced internal engine friction beyond initial specifications." Howard pointed to a complex chart showing fuel consumption rates. "In practical terms, your aircraft now maintain combustion at significantly lower fuel pressures than documented in your flight manuals. What this means is simple but revolutionary. When your gauge reads empty, you still have approximately 30 to 40 minutes of flight time remaining." The room remained silent as pilots processed this information. For men who had been trained from their first flight that an empty fuel gauge meant imminent disaster, this revelation bordered on the miraculous. "I know what you're thinking," Howard said with a knowing smile. We've had this drilled into us since flight school. Never trust fuel gauges, always maintain a safety margin, and never ever run your tanks dry. Today, I'm telling you to forget that training when the situation demands it. Captain Richard Turner, a squadron commander with 11 kills, voiced what many were thinking. Sir, with respect, are we really asking boys barely out of flight school to deliberately fly their aircraft until the tanks run dry? Howard nodded gravely. That's precisely what I'm asking, Captain. This isn't just about squeezing a few extra miles from each gallon. It's about psychological warfare. The Luftwaffe calculates our range based on standard fuel consumption. When they see our fighters appearing over targets we shouldn't be able to reach, staying longer than should be possible, it creates confusion in their defensive planning. He paused, letting the implications sink in. More importantly, it creates fear. German pilots are already battling fuel restrictions that limit their training time to a fraction of yours. Now imagine their reaction when they realize that even with empty tanks, you can still outfly them. In the weeks that followed, American fighter pilots began cautiously testing their newfound capabilities. The first deliberate empty tank mission was flown by the 361st Fighter Group, escorting bombers to Leipzig. When their fuel gauges hit the red line, rather than turning back, they continued the escort mission, providing critical protection during the most vulnerable phase of the bombing run. The psychological effect on the German defenders was immediate and profound. Luftwaffe pilot Oberfeldwebel Kurt Schulze recorded in his diary on March 12, 1945, encountered American fighters 120 kilometers east of their expected range today. They seemed to appear from nowhere, long after they should have been forced to turn back. We lost 3 aircraft in the initial engagement. The Americans seem to be operating under different physical laws than we are. For Lieutenant Wilkins, the first true test of this new tactic came during a bomber escort mission to Munich on March 24th. His flight of 4 Mustangs had been separated from the main formation after tangling with a group of Messerschmitt 109 fighters. After dispatching 2 enemy aircraft, they found themselves much deeper into German territory than planned, with fuel gauges hovering near empty. "Checkmate, leader to flight. Fuel status?" Wilkins called over the radio. "Checkmate 2, I'm on fumes, sir," responded Lieutenant Samuel Davis, anxiety evident in his voice despite his efforts to sound calm. "Checkmate 3, gauge reading empty for the past 10 minutes, reported Lieutenant Thomas Graham. "Checkmate 4, same here, sir," added Lieutenant John Morrison. "Manual calculations say we should have flamed out 5 minutes ago." Wilkins checked his own gauge, the needle firmly resting on empty. Under normal circumstances, they would all be preparing to bail out over enemy territory. Instead, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "Checkmate flight, we're continuing to the rendezvous point with the bombers. Stay in formation, maintain altitude, and remember your briefing. These birds will keep flying longer than the gauge says." As they pushed onward, the psychological burden of flying on supposedly empty tanks weighed heavily on each pilot. Every sputter of the engine, every slight vibration, normal occurrences barely noticed during regular flight, now sent spikes of anxiety through the cockpit. Yet minute after minute, the powerful Merlin engines continued to purr, defying the empty gauges. When they finally rejoined the bomber formation, providing escort for the crucial return leg of the journey, the bomber crews were astonished to see them arrive. "Where did you boys come from?" crackled the voice of a B-17 pilot over the radio. "Our fighter controller said you were all heading home on bingo fuel 20 minutes ago." "Let's just say American engineering is full of surprises," Wilkins responded, with forced casualness that belied his own amazement at their aircraft's performance. Back at Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, intelligence officers were growing increasingly perplexed by reports from across the front. General Adolf Galland, the renowned fighter ace now serving as General of Fighters for the Luftwaffe, called an emergency meeting of his technical staff in early April. "The Americans are now routinely appearing over targets 200 to 300 kilometers beyond their calculated maximum range," Galland stated, circling areas on a large wall map. "Their loiter time over targets has increased by approximately 40%. Either they have secretly developed drop tanks with substantially larger capacity, or they have implemented some new fuel system we don't understand." Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, A propulsion specialist from the Messerschmitt Design Bureau shook his head. "General, we've recovered and examined several downed P-51s. Their fuel systems are essentially unchanged from our previous intelligence. The only significant difference we've noted is the remarkable precision of their engine components, particularly in the piston rings and cylinder walls." "What significance does that have?" demanded Galland. "Reduced friction translates to improved fuel efficiency," Schmidt explained, "but not to the extent we're observing. There must be something else, perhaps an additive in their fuel or some emergency reserve system we haven't identified." What neither the Germans nor many American pilots fully understood was that the advantage came not from any secret technology or hidden fuel reserves, but from the sheer manufacturing precision that America's vast industrial capacity made possible. While German aircraft were increasingly being built by forced labor using declining quality materials, American engines were being produced with unprecedented consistency and precision on automated production lines. At the Packard Motor Car Company plant in Detroit, Michigan, production engineer Eleanor Reynolds supervised the manufacturing of Merlin engines under license from Rolls-Royce. A rare woman in a leadership position during wartime production, Reynolds had implemented quality control measures that exceeded even British specifications. "Our tolerance standards for the cylinder bores are 0.0015 inches, Reynolds explained to visiting military officials that April. "That's approximately 1/3 the thickness of a human hair. When multiplied across 12 cylinders operating at over 3,000 revolutions per minute, these tolerances translate to significant improvements in fuel efficiency." Colonel Mark Bradley of the Army Air Force's Technical Division was impressed but skeptical. "The test pilots at Wright Field are reporting operational times exceeding the specifications by nearly 40%. Your manufacturing tolerances alone can't account for that." Reynolds smiled confidently. "It's not just the tolerances, Colonel. It's the consistency. Every engine that leaves this factory performs identically to our benchmark standards. In England, each Rolls-Royce Merlin is essentially hand-built, with slight variations from one engine to the next. Pilots learn the quirks of their particular aircraft and adjust accordingly." She led the visitors to the testing area, where freshly assembled engines underwent final inspection. "Our mass production techniques mean that every single engine meets the same exact specifications. This allows us to calibrate the fuel system more precisely than ever before, with much smaller safety margins." Bradley nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So the fuel gauges are deliberately calibrated conservatively." "Precisely," Reynolds confirmed. "The gauges show empty when approximately 15% of usable fuel remains in the system. This was initially a safety measure, but as we've refined the manufacturing process, the actual remaining fuel when the gauge reads empty has increased." "And the pilots aren't being told the exact margins," Bradley said, more a statement than a question. "Some information has been shared with squadron commanders, but the specific percentages are classified. From a psychological perspective, it's actually better for the pilots to believe in the superiority of American technology than to simply know they're flying with a hidden reserve." By mid-April 1945, the empty tank tactic had become standard procedure among American fighter groups. Pilots no longer turned back when their gauges hit empty during critical phases of a mission, instead pressing on with newfound confidence. This operational change had profound effects on both sides of the conflict. For Luftwaffe pilots like Oberleutnant Franz Weber, the seemingly supernatural endurance of American fighters created a sense of fatalism. Weber wrote in a letter to his brother on April 18th, "The Americans now seem to fly without regard to fuel limitations. We calculate their range based on everything we know about aircraft performance, yet they appear over Berlin, over Prague, over targets they should not be able to reach, and remain there fighting long after their tanks should be dry. How can we defend against an enemy who defies the fundamental constraints of aerial warfare?" The psychological impact extended beyond just the pilots. German air defense planning had been built around the known operational ranges of Allied aircraft. Entire defensive systems had been calibrated based on the assumption that fighter escorts would be forced to turn back at certain distances, leaving bombers vulnerable during the deeper portions of their routes. Now those calculations were rendered meaningless. For American pilots, The knowledge that their aircraft could continue flying, even when instruments showed empty, created a new kind of confidence. Lieutenant Wilkins found himself volunteering for the most demanding long-range missions he would have considered suicidal just months earlier. During a massive bombing raid against oil facilities in Brux, Czechoslovakia on April 28th, Wilkins' squadron was jumped by a formation of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. In the swirling dogfight that followed, he became separated from his wingman and found himself alone, 60 miles from the nearest friendly aircraft, with his fuel gauge well past empty. In his combat report filed later that day, Wilkins described what happened next. Encountered two FW-190 aircraft at approximately 1100 hours. Despite fuel gauge reading empty for approximately 20 minutes, engaged enemy aircraft rather than attempting to disengage and return to formation. Shot down one FW-190 confirmed, damaged second aircraft before it fled eastward. Continued mission for additional 43 minutes on supposedly empty tanks before rejoining bomber stream for return flight. What Wilkins didn't include in his official report was the psychological transformation he experienced during those minutes. Flying and fighting with an empty gauge created a strange sense of invincibility, as if the normal rules of warfare had been suspended for American pilots. It was a sentiment shared by many of his fellow airmen who began to view their aircraft as almost magical in their capabilities. This confidence was not without its costs, however. On May 2nd, Lieutenant Davis, Wilkins' wingman, pushed the limits too far during a mission deep into southern Germany. His Mustang finally ran dry of fuel 20 miles short of friendly lines. He managed to glide across the front and crash land in a field near American positions, surviving with only minor injuries. During his debriefing, Davis was both shaken and amazed. "I flew for 57 minutes after my gauge hit empty, sir." 57 minutes. The tech manual says that should be impossible. I kept waiting for the engine to quit with every passing minute, but it just kept going until there was literally nothing left in the tanks. Major Howard used the incident as a teaching moment for the group. What Lieutenant Davis experienced demonstrates both the advantage and the limitation of our current situation. Yes, you can fly significantly longer than the gauges indicate, but there is still a physical limit. The key is developing an intuitive sense for your aircraft's true capabilities beyond what the instruments tell you. As the air war entered its final weeks, the empty tank tactic began to take on an almost mythical status among both Allied and Axis pilots. German propaganda tried to explain away the phenomenon, attributing it to hidden auxiliary fuel tanks or exaggerated claims. The reality that American manufacturing precision had created this advantage was simultaneously more mundane and more significant. On the morning of May 7, 1945, Lieutenant Wilkins led a flight of Mustangs on what would be his final combat mission of the war. With Germany on the verge of surrender, his squadron was tasked with providing air cover for advancing Allied ground forces near Prague. As they patrolled at 20,000 feet, Wilkins spotted a lone Messerschmitt 109 flying northward, apparently on a reconnaissance mission. Despite his fuel gauge having read empty for nearly 20 minutes, he called to his wingman, "Checkmate 2, I'm going after that 109. Cover me." "Copy that, lead," responded Lieutenant Graham, who had replaced Davis as his wingman. "But we're both running on fumes. Gauge has been on empty since we crossed into Czechoslovakia. American fumes seem to burn longer than German aviation fuel," Wilkins replied with the confidence of a pilot who had repeatedly defied conventional limitations. "Let's go get him." The two Mustangs dove toward the unsuspecting German aircraft, their Merlin engines performing flawlessly despite the empty tank warnings. The Messerschmitt pilot, spotting the approaching Americans, immediately turned to flee rather than engage, a telling indication of the psychological shift that had occurred in the air war. After a brief chase, the German pilot, apparently believing he could outlast the American fighters he assumed must be low on fuel, made a critical error. Rather than using his aircraft's superior climbing ability to escape, he remained in a shallow dive, trying to outrun the Mustangs. It was a fatal miscalculation. Wilkins closed to firing range and sent a burst of 50 caliber rounds into the Messerschmitt's engine. The German aircraft trailed smoke, then flame, before the pilot bailed out. "Checkmate leader, splash 1, Wilkins reported calmly. "Let's head home." As they turned westward, Graham's voice came over the radio, tense with concern. "Lead, I'm at 65 minutes past empty. I don't think—" His transmission was cut short as his engine sputtered, coughed, and went silent. "Checkmate 2, begin emergency glide procedures," Wilkins ordered, watching as Graham's Mustang began its engineless descent. "We're over friendly territory. Set up for a dead-stick landing on that field at your 2 o'clock." "Copy that," Graham replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "At least we pushed the envelope right to the end." As Wilkins circled above, Graham executed a textbook dead-stick landing in a recently harvested wheat field, touching down with minimal damage to his aircraft. Wilkins, his own engine still running despite nearly 70 minutes of flight with an empty tank, continued toward their base. Upon landing back at Bodney, Wilkins was immediately summoned to the operations room, where he found not only Major Howard, but also several high-ranking officers from 8th Air Force headquarters. The atmosphere was one of celebration rather than the solemn mood that had prevailed through much of the war. "Lieutenant Wilkins," Howard greeted him. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining to these gentlemen the practical applications of our fuel reserve tactics. Your flight today set a new group record, 73 minutes of operation beyond indicated fuel exhaustion." A silver-haired colonel stepped forward. "Lieutenant, I'm Colonel James Bennett from Technical Services Command. The data we've gathered from missions like yours has been invaluable. What you pilots have demonstrated isn't just a wartime advantage. It's going to transform commercial aviation in the post-war world." Wilkins, still processing the events of the day, including the loss of Graham's aircraft, wasn't immediately receptive to celebrating. "With respect, sir, my wingman is currently sitting in a field about 80 miles east of here because we pushed too far. The tactic works, but it's still gambling with men's lives." Bennett nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. And that's precisely why I'm here. The information we've gathered on real-world performance versus instrumental readings is being incorporated into the next generation of aircraft design. Future pilots won't have to guess how much fuel they really have left." Howard added, "What you and your fellow pilots have done, somewhat unwittingly, is participate in the most comprehensive field test of aircraft performance ever conducted. Every mission flown on empty tanks has provided data that our engineers could never have gathered in controlled test conditions." The significance of what had been achieved began to dawn on Wilkins. What had started as a desperate tactic born of necessity had evolved into something that would have lasting implications for aviation as a whole. 2 days later, on May 9, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. The empty tank tactic, like many wartime innovations, quickly transitioned from military secret to technical case study. Engineers from Packard, Rolls-Royce, and other engine manufacturers analyzed the performance data to understand precisely how the combination of manufacturing precision and conservative instrumentation had created such dramatic results. For the Luftwaffe pilots who had witnessed American fighters that seemed to defy the basic laws of aeronautics, the truth was both simpler and more demoralizing than any secret technology might have been. They had not been defeated by some revolutionary invention, but by the sheer industrial might of the United States, its ability to mass-produce aircraft engines to standards of precision that German manufacturing, increasingly hampered by bombing and resource shortages, could not match. In his debriefing after being captured in the war's closing days, Luftwaffe Major Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace of all time, with 352 confirmed victories, expressed his frustration. "We had better tactics, better initial training, and in many cases better aircraft designs, but we could not compete with American industrial capacity. When we heard reports of their fighters flying for impossible distances on empty tanks, many of us suspected some secret technology. The reality that it was simply the quality of their standard engines was perhaps more impressive and certainly more disheartening." Lieutenant Wilkins returned to the United States in August 1945, transitioning to a post-war career as a test pilot for North American aviation. The lessons learned from his wartime experience with the empty tank tactic directly influenced his approach to aircraft testing and fuel system design. What we discovered somewhat accidentally during combat has fundamentally changed how we think about aircraft range and fuel management, Wilkins explained in a 1947 interview for an aviation journal. The psychological aspect was perhaps even more significant than the technical one. When pilots believe their aircraft can perform beyond stated limitations, they fly differently, more confidently, more aggressively. Eleanor Reynolds, the production engineer from the Packard plant, went on to a distinguished career in aviation manufacturing. The quality control systems she implemented during wartime production became industry standards, and her emphasis on precision engineering influenced everything from fuel gauges to hydraulic systems in post-war aircraft. What we learned during the war about the relationship between manufacturing precision and actual performance has applications far beyond military aviation, Reynolds noted during a speech to the Society of Automotive Engineers in 1948. When we build to higher standards than required and calibrate instruments conservatively, we create a margin of safety that translates into confidence for operators. The empty tank tactic represented more than just a clever wartime innovation. It embodied the American approach to industrial warfare, leveraging manufacturing capacity and precision engineering to create advantages that no amount of enemy skill or courage could overcome. The psychological impact on both American and German pilots demonstrated how technical capabilities directly influenced combat performance through their effect on human perception and confidence. For Lieutenant Robert Wilkins and thousands of other American pilots, the experience of routinely flying beyond what their instruments told them was possible created a lasting impression that extended well beyond the war. It was a lesson in the relationship between technology, psychology, and human performance, a lesson that would influence aviation for decades to come. As former Luftwaffe pilot Kurt Schulze, who immigrated to the United States in 1952 and eventually became an engineer for Boeing, put it, "The Americans taught us that the limits of performance are often determined not by the physical capabilities of the machine, but by our understanding of those capabilities." When their pilots kept flying with empty fuel gauges, they weren't actually defying physics. They were simply operating with better information than we had. In warfare, as in life, superior information often makes the difference between what seems impossible and what becomes routine. The legacy of the empty tank tactic lives on in modern aviation, where fuel systems are designed with reserves that exceed what instruments display to pilots, creating a safety margin that has saved countless lives. What began as a desperate wartime measure evolved into a fundamental principle of aircraft design, a principle born from the unique circumstances of aerial combat over Europe in the final months of World War II, when American pilots routinely accomplished what their enemies considered impossible, landing safely after flying without fuel. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.